Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. So, my best and worst for different genre lists roll on. And yeah, I think by the time you're seeing this, Christmas has already happened. So, hope it was a good one. I think today is Boxing Day, so happy Boxing Day. And yeah, when I say best and worst, I think I've mentioned this before, but basically what I'm talking about is mostly like favorites and disappointments. And I do have a video that already has come out with my actual like worst list. So like books that I genuinely think are like the worst ones of the year. So I'll mention some of those in my disappointments, but mostly you can look at that. And then I think on New Year's Eve, you'll see my best of the year list, which is like all categories what I thought the best books of the year were. So yeah, you can look forward to that. But for today, we are talking about my best and worst favorites, disappointments of SFF. So / speculative fiction / whatever. Now I will tell you pretty much all of this is fantasy. There's one speculative fiction and one or like genre bending kind of thing and one sci-fi, but really basically this is just a list of my favorite fantasy books of the year. And then I definitely did also have a few disappointments, so we'll talk about that. But with that being said, let's just dive right into this. Okay, so starting at number 10 is the only true sci-fi book on this list, and that is 6 Wakes by Mur Lafferty. So I don't know that I really talked about this much on this channel, but I did read this book this year. Mur Lafferty is somebody who I followed her podcasting career for a very long time now, and I really enjoy her as a person. I also tried and enjoyed her urban fantasy series that she had a couple years ago, which was I think called The Shambler's Guide to New York City, something like that. I liked that little series. But this was the first sci-fi thing I'd tried from her, and I have to say I really enjoyed it. This is basically, and I should say part of what I enjoyed was that she took a trope that I adore and then put it in a sci-fi context. So this basically is a locked room murder mystery, but set in space. So basically it's 6 people who have like all these clones. They're on like a very long starship voyage to a new planet kind of a thing. They're the crew that's running it. They're taking all these people with them, and they have clones that they have to like move their consciousness into once they die, because it's a very long trip. And at some point in the trip, they all are regenerated at the same time into their clone bodies, and it becomes clear that one of them murdered all the other ones. Like there was some sort of like bloody mass murder spree situation happening, and they have to spend the rest of the book like unraveling what happened. Now, do I think this was like revolutionary sci-fi? No. Do I think it was like a revolutionary mystery? No. But I thought it was a fun genre mashup. I really enjoyed this in terms of just like, this was a fun read for me, and definitely was my best attempt at sci-fi this year. I realized I didn't actually read that much sci-fi this year, so I need to work on that for next year, but it was definitely my favorite of what I read in sci-fi this year, and I gave this 4 stars. Next up is Phoenix Unbound by Grace Draven. This and a couple of other titles kind of straddle the line in terms of what genre they should be in. So this is definitely what I would call it's a fantasy, and it really is a fantasy romance. But the reason I put it on this list rather than my romance list is that what I was enjoying about this book was the fantasy part of it more so than the relationship part. So Phoenix Unbound, essentially the premise, it's like a really, by the way, all the trigger warnings on this, because baked into the premise is like sexual assault and brutality. But basically it's about 2 people who are caught up in this like religious sacrificial system in their world, and how they are able to escape that and like start a revolution. Yes, it's a romance between them, but really for me what I was interested in was the world and like what was happening in terms of like more the like political machination piece of things. So that's why I put it on this list. I didn't like this as much as I've liked other things from her. Like Radiance from her is definitely my fave. But I thought this was really, really good. I think this was her first like mainstream published book, and I will definitely continue in the series. I would definitely recommend this to anyone who's okay with like a pretty brutal setup. And Grace Draven is someone I often recommend for people who are interested in maybe a more romance heavy book, but already are into fantasy. Like this, she's kind of a great middle of the line type author. Number 8 is Sightwitch by Susan Dennard. So I read all 3 of the already published Witchland books this year as a part of like a little buddy read situation I had going with Beautifully Bookish Bethany, Leanna from Leanna's Library, and Amanda from The Naughty Librarian. We all read this series together this year. This was definitely my personal favorite, and this is a prequel novella that I would very strongly argue should just be read as the first book in the series. series because I think this sets up the other two books in terms of the world building very nicely. I also just really like the story that this tells in and of itself, and this was my favorite installment in them. I think it was more focused in terms of the plot, and it didn't have as much packed in. So I am really excited for Blood Witch, which will be the fourth book in the series coming out next year, because I think a lot of the setup is now ready for that book to come out. But I really enjoyed this installment in particular, and I've enjoyed that series as a whole, so you know, I think having at least one book on there is good in terms of representing some of the fantasy I was reading this year. This was something I was reading and enjoying. Number 7 is Red Sister by Mark Lawrence. I would say, looking at my list, this definitely qualifies as my favorite immersive fantasy that I read this year, meaning a fantasy that is set wholly in another world. Like, you know, think Lord of the Rings is sort of the classic, like high fantasy, whatever you want to say. This was definitely my favorite one I read this year. I really like the world. It's sort of a fantasy post-apocalyptic situation. I loved the characters, and I loved the sort of magic system and the premise. I mean, the premise is essentially a girl who is recruited into a magical boarding school set at a convent filled with warrior nuns, and hijinks ensue. So I really liked pretty much everything that was happening in this book. The reason I gave it 4 stars and not more is just because I do think pacing wise and some of the like plot choices he made weren't my favorite, but especially towards the end I was really like, it's just really good, and I'm very excited to continue with the series. I have the next one that I think I'll read in January probably. There's a novella coming out this month, and then I think it might be the final book, but the 3rd book is coming out in April, so I'm excited to catch up with and then maybe even finish that series. But it was just really, really good. Very much enjoyed that, and like I said, my favorite high fantasy type book I read this year. Number 6 is my highest rate. This is my last 4-star book on this list, and it's the highest one in those, and that is Magic Triumph by Ilona Andrews, which rounds out her Kate Daniels series, at least the main series. We'll talk about some of the spinoffs here in a minute. And this is the 10th book of that 10-book arc, and I thought this was a really successful finale to a long-running series. Was it perfect? No. I think essentially my biggest critique here is that I think it probably should have been longer because there was a lot packed in, and sort of a pro and con is that I think you kind of knew what the overall contours of the solution to the series was going to be prior to coming in, but that's just because they set it up really well and then they executed on it. So I don't want to get too nitpicky about like, oh, you had a plausible ending based on what you'd set up. Like, that seems like a petty critique, but it wasn't as surprising as maybe I would want it to be like a 5-star book. But this was a really solid ending to a series. I actually did a whole pregame reread of the entire series before we got to that, the last one, and I really enjoyed rereading all of them and remembering how much I love this series. I do think if you've not gotten into this series yet, I can officially tell you they stick the landing. Ilona Andrews, every series that I've finished from them has ended well. I think that they are really good at having an overall game plan and executing on it. And this was no exception. So really enjoyed this. You can see all my reviews for the series. And then this was also a good book for me, and probably I have warm feelings for it because this was right in the week where my father was dying, basically. And this was like the perfect kind of like escape during that, kind of in the unknown time. Like, this was a really good thing to read, and like, because I've read it so long, like, just the comfort factor of it was very high. So I'm very thankful for this book as well, in terms of just like giving me a nice little like respite when I needed it. But I do think that the series ends really well, and I'm very excited for all the spin-off series that are to come. Okay, now we move into my 4.5s. I've got 4 of those. So number 5 is The Hazelwood by Melissa Albert, which still is going to get my award for most beautiful cover this year. I absolutely just love this as a physical object. Yeah, I really enjoyed this. I call this, it's marketed as YA. I don't really think it is. I think it's much more of like a coming of age novel, or a Bildungsroman, I think is the official title for that. I would call this portal fantasy Catcher in the Rye. And I think if that's your expectation going into it, and not like a straight up YA immersive fantasy, you're gonna like it better. I know this was somewhat divisive, but I really like this. I like the writing, I liked the characters a lot, and I really liked the world and the overall, like, I just liked pretty much everything about this. I thought this was really, really good. I will say that I thought this was a standalone, and I really like this as a standalone, and now that I know that there's going to be more, I may retrospectively end up not liking this as much, because I think the ending of this is like awesome. and brutal, and also like I kind of like where it leaves things. So we'll see how I may or may not continue in the series, I'm not sure, but I really liked this book individually, and I wish more people would give it a chance. I think if you have the right expectations going into it, I think you're more likely to enjoy it. Number 4 is my next 4.5, which is Every Heart a Doorway by Seanan McGuire. I caught up with the whole Wayward Children's series this year and really enjoyed them all. Some more than others, and this so far is still my favorite in the series, but this is just a really great short novel that is a take on portal fantasy and essentially asking the question of like, what is it like for children who go into these other worlds, a la Narnia or whatever, and come back? Like, what really is their psychology? What is life like for them? And then there's, on top of that, a great murder mystery plot in this, which I don't think was too hard to figure out, but it was enjoyable in terms of the engine of the story. So great premise, great characters, and a great world. So I think this was a really successful book, and the series overall is really enjoyable, even though I think this is 4.5 stars for me, and definitely the most successful to my mind so far in the series. Okay, and then I guess this is my best YA fantasy of the year. This is essentially alternative history fantasy with like monsters in it, which is why I think it belongs in the fantasy category, but that is Dread Nation by Justina Ireland. Basically, the premise of this is an alternative Reconstruction America that is populated by zombies, and the outbreak of zombies is what ended the American Civil War. So, and then our main character is a girl who has been trained to be a zombie killer, and she is essentially mixed race. And the world building and fantasy elements of this, I loved. The plot took a while to get going, but once it did, I thought was really strong. And then just like, I really like the characters in this, and thematically, this book is exactly what I want YA to be doing, which is exploring hard questions and hard themes in a way that is not subtextual, but is pretty textual, and therefore allows readers who are learning how to like read for themes to pick up on them pretty clearly, but it doesn't water those themes down. It just makes them explicit rather than implicit. And essentially thematically, this is about the whole idea of respectability politics and the idea of passing and the idea of assimilation into a majority culture. Like, thematically, this book has so much going for it. And then on a story level, I personally just love this. So I'm really excited for where this series is going to go. I think by the end, like, things are really getting cooking. And so like, I'm excited to see just like on an enjoyment story level where this goes. But again, the reason I put this as my top pick for YA fantasy this year is just that I think thematically, this is far and away the most sophisticated one that I read this year. Okay, number 2 is my top 4.5 star pick. And I alluded to it earlier that it is a spin-off book, which is Iron and Magic, which is a spin-off of the main Kate Daniels series that I was talking about by Ilona Andrews. And this is the first of a trilogy called Iron Covenant. Now, both this and Magic Triumphs, the reason I put it on the fantasy, the SFF list, is that what I enjoy most in these is the characters in the fantasy world, not so much the romance, though there is definitely romantic element. Like, these are like alternative future urban fantasy romances, even though some people don't want to acknowledge that is the case. But what I most enjoy is the world and the characters, which is why I felt like it belonged on the fantasy list and not the romance list. Okay, that being said, this series is so cool because it is one of the most successful first books in a spin-off series I've ever read. I love that they chose to give Hugh a spin-off series, because if you don't read these books, Hugh is probably the second biggest villain in the main series, but then like things happen, and I don't want to spoil anything, but now he has his own series, and like making him our protagonist and like a hero basically is so interesting, and it's being handled really well. I really am engaged with like some of the mysteries that this series is getting into in terms of Alara and what her deal is. Like, there's just a lot of cool questions raised in this. It was satisfying. It was satisfying in and of itself as like a book unto itself. It was satisfying as the beginning of a trilogy. Like, I'm interested in the bigger macro things that will happen in the trilogy. And then it also worked in terms of the overall Kate Daniels world. So I thought that was just really impressive. I just was impressed by this book in general. Also, it's Ilona Andrews, who can almost do no wrong for me. So like, it hit me. It gave me all the things that I like in a book in this book. So I really enjoyed it, and that's why it's my top 4.5 star pick / my number 2 favorite overall. Okay, so before we go to my favorite of the year, favorite SFF book of the year / speculative fiction / whatever, I'm going to talk about my biggest disappointments. And so a couple of these showed up on my worst of the year list, and those were RoseBlood by A.G. Howard and Artemis by Andy Weir. Those were on my like worst of 2018 list. But then other ones that were disappointing. So 2 DNFs that disappointed me. One was Wintersong by S Jae Jones, which is an immersive YA fantasy that was just way too angsty for me, which is why I DNF'd it. And then Nevernight by Jay Kristoff is like probably my most disappointing book. I DNF'd it and I just couldn't, it was basically the authorial voice. I just could not get into it, which really, really bummed me out. A couple of other disappointments. A Gathering of Shadows by VE Schwab. Definitely a big disappointment. You can see my whole rant about that somewhere else. But yeah, I was really disappointed that as a book and definitely as the second book in a series. A Discovery of Witches by Deborah Harkness is sort of like a historical time-traveling paranormal romance that I think is way overhyped. I didn't think that first book was anything special, and while it was well written, I think if you read a lot in that genre, I don't think it's doing anything interesting, and in fact is pretty darn boring. So 2 stars on that one. Toil Trouble was a very hyped witch-based short story collection that came out this year that I thought was just really not that great. And actually it was very hyped up at the beginning of the year, but then when people actually started reading it, pretty much the consensus was like, yeah, this isn't that good. So 2 stars on that. And then A Court of Frost and Starlight. So I'll talk about that more in my surprising books of the year. But basically I just found this to be really very Kindle Unlimited paranormal romance. Like I don't know. It was perfectly fine for what it actually is, but I just think if we're talking about it as like a fantasy book, like definitely a huge disappointment. If we're talking about it as like Kindle Unlimited smutty fun, it was fine. But yeah, so that was also a disappointment. Okay, so now we come to my favorite fantasy / SFF / speculative fiction book that I read this year. And originally I gave this book 4.5 stars, but as I have thought about it so much since then and talked about it and recommended it so much since then, I realized that it actually is an all-time favorite and therefore a 5-star and therefore my favorite fantasy book of the year. And that is The Library at Mount Char by Scott Hawkins. So this is definitely like a genre-bending book. I think I've landed on calling it speculative fiction because like it could be read as it's somewhat post-apocalyptic, it's somewhat near-future dystopia, it's somewhat fantasy, and it's somewhat sci-fi. Like it's just real hard to tell you exactly what this book is, and you can't really get into a lot of details about this book because it would spoil it. I really like the Poptimist review of it, so maybe if I remember, I'll link that somewhere, because I think he does a really good job of describing what makes this book special. And I think that this will provoke a reaction in you, even if you don't like it or don't love it. I think that this is a very interesting book that demands a lot of its readers in terms of like keeping up with what it's doing. It has a level of disorientation in this book that the author is in control of that I love. And it's hard to describe that to people, like when you're trying to find read-alike titles. But like something like The Rook by Daniel O'Malley, I think also has that, where you aren't totally sure what's happening in this book at any given point in time, but it's purposeful and therefore like it doesn't feel frustrating, at least to me. I felt like I don't really see how all these things come together, but I feel like they're going to. Like it felt purposeful, so I was patient with it. This book is just so like interesting. It's like dark. It is real dark, and I should definitely give you a content warning for like violence and sexual assault for sure. But it just has like such interesting different pieces of it that get mushed together in a way that ultimately actually like works as a book. And I just feel like this is a feat of genre bending writing that I really admire, and like am very excited for him to produce more books, because like this was just so good and something that I like to recommend to people as something weird that they might enjoy. So this is definitely my favorite, like, speculative fiction, fantasy, whatever book of the year. Yeah, I just really love this. So yeah, that does it for my fantasy list for the year. I actually read quite a bit of fantasy or things that could be considered SFF or speculative fiction this year, and I was enjoying it. Like, it was something that for whatever reason I got in the mood to read at various points in the year, so I ended up reading more of it than I normally do. And I ended up reading some, I think in terms of like hardest to pick favorites for, this was definitely the category, because I had a lot of 4-star reads in this category that could have made this list. I read more in this genre than I normally do, and I read more things that I was liking in this genre than I normally do. So it was a really good year for SFF for me, and you will see some of that reflected in my best of the year. So stay tuned for that. I think that's coming on Monday. So stay tuned to see what ultimate best of is. But I think for now, I have one more video in these genre type best and worst list, which is coming out on Friday, and I think is my nonfiction one. And then Monday we'll get to my best of the year. So Listapalooza rolls on, guys. But anyway, I think that will do it for this video. So if you enjoyed this, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below. And I think that will do it. I hope you guys are having a really lovely day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye!